Hello, welcome to the second session of our programming on the history, application, and future of wargaming. I'm Reid Pauly. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Brown University and one of three organizers of this webinar together with Erik Lin-Greenberg and Jackie Schneider. We'd like to thank, just at the start, our co-sponsors, our hosts at the Hoover Institution, Stanford, co-sponsored with the MIT Security Studies program and Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. This series is inspired by a lot of you in the audience, all of the innovative work being done today in many institutions related to wargaming methods. And it is our goal to add to a conversation in the social sciences, especially about the use of wargaming methods to answer research questions. To that end, Jackie Schneider, Erik Lin-Greenberg, and I also have just published an article in the European Journal of International Relations, EJIR, that talks about the exciting growth of wargaming in the field of political science, especially, and lays out a bit of a research agenda. This article has graciously been ungated by the editors during this webinar series, so I will post a link in the chat shortly for everyone to go download it for free while it is out from behind the paywall. As I mentioned, this is the second in our series. Last time we had a terrific conversation about the history of wargaming and archival research on wargaming. I'll also post a link in the chat to the YouTube video recording of last session. Just a reminder before we start today that there will be another session, a final session, on March 16th on war games and national security, which is going to focus on the policy impact of wargaming and have a conversation that'll include former Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work, Dr. Mika Zenko, and Dr. Stacey Pettyjohn will be there as well. So for the rest of today's conversation, I'd like to turn it over to Erik Lin-Greenberg of MIT to introduce our guests and lead us in a discussion about wargaming, design, and social science. Erik, floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much for the introduction, Reid. So as Reid mentioned, last week we had a really incredible conversation on the history of wargaming and on the important lessons that we can learn by viewing wargame data as a sort of archival record. So today I really hope to continue that conversation by exploring wargame design. Particularly how we might think about leveraging best practices and principles from social science research methods as part of the wargame design process. And by that, I mean principles like experimental design, sampling and recruitment, external or ecological validity. And our conversation today really takes place in the midst of a renaissance in wargaming among political scientists, particularly those that are interested in studying questions of international security, where real-world data are either really scant or just difficult to observe. And so we know that researchers have long used a variety of different approaches, such as historical case studies, to explore these issues. But in recent years, we've seen a turn in scholarship in which researchers are using a variety of synthetic data generating processes, like lab experiments and experiments embedded in surveys, to produce data that allow them to really closely examine causal relationships. And as part of this shift, we've seen a significant increase in the number of researchers using wargames in their work. So while many of the examples that we'll talk about today deal with academic studies of conflict and international security, I think that many of the lessons that hopefully will come out of this discussion are more broadly applicable outside of academia and more broadly applicable outside of security studies and international relations, really to anyone interested in using simulations or wargaming to really understand human behavior and decision-making in a variety of different contexts, be it in business, politics, or something else. But yet regardless of the substantive focus of this research, I think researchers using wargames will confront a number of challenges and key decisions in their design process. So what are the trade-offs of using wargames? What types of information can wargames provide? And really, what are the limitations of wargames? And I really can't think of anyone better to discuss these issues with us than our two distinguished panelists today. So let me introduce them, and then we'll dive right into the subject matter. So Dr. Rose McDermott is the David and Mariana Fisher University Professor of International Relations at Brown University and a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Dr. McDermott's work focuses on political psychology, really exploring how human behavior and psychology affects decision makings in the international security and international relations domain. And I think many of us credit Rose with really starting this wargaming renaissance with an article that she published in 2007 in the Annals of the American Academy of Political Science and Social Science that explored aggression in a crisis simulation. I'll ask Rose to talk a little bit about that in a bit. And our other panelist is Dr. Andrew Reddy, who is an assistant professor of practice at UC Berkeley School of Information and a senior engineer at India National Laboratories. And his work focuses on cybersecurity, nuclear weapons, and emerging military technology. And he's really at the forefront of work on experimental wargaming, including a publication on the topic in the journal Science, and also a forthcoming article in the Journal of Peace Research. So thanks to both of you for being here today. And so I want to open really by asking you to describe some of your wargaming work. So Rose, I'd like you to talk a little bit about your 2007 article to start off with, and we'll have Andrew talk about some of his recent findings. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Eric. I really appreciate it. It's nice to have an opportunity to revisit some of this work. The original experiments that I ran, some element of which was in the article you mentioned, actually was inspired in large part by Steve Rosen, who was and still is in the government department at Harvard. And he had been able to receive a grant from the Office of Net Assessment in the Department of Defense because they were quite interested in some of these questions related to the influence of hormones on aggressive behavior. And so we conducted a series of experiments with their generous funding at Harvard, actually in the basement of the business school was where we ran the experiments. And what we were trying to do was get at the question that they were interested in about the influence of hormones. And obviously it's not something where there was a lot of existing data. It wasn't like you could go to the DoD and say, hey, can you guys take a bunch of blood tests from the people that are in combat, right? Like it was not only logistically unfeasible, but unethical, right? So when I think about the origin of a lot of this work, it isn't just things where it's difficult because we don't have data, like there hasn't thankfully been a nuclear war, so we don't have a lot of data on the outcome of what would happen in the wake of a nuclear conflict. But there's also aspects of it where it's kind of unethical. And so the work that we designed was intended to sort of be a hypothetical, like as if or what if. And there's had been at the time, this is the early 2000s, a number of very first line MRI studies showing that the way that people made decision making and processing in their brain when they dealt with a hypothetical was the exact same pathways as when they actually did it themselves. And so we thought, that's really interesting. If we can get at these processes, these as if processes, and engage the same decision making strategies and mechanisms as when people actually do it, that comes as close as you're going to get without having logistical or ethical violations. And so that was the sort of inspiration of it. And we ran a series of these war games where we had subjects play against each other in a simulated conflict where they had to role play that they were the leader of a country and the other person was the leader of another country. And there were certain resources we gave them, certain challenges we gave them, and certain options we gave them. And some people went to war and some people didn't go to war, and we could sort of play it out among, several hundred people to look at the outcomes of it. And so that was sort of the original source and what we were trying to accomplish. And obviously others who have done war games sequentially have been much more sophisticated, but that was sort of the inspiration of what we were starting to do and why.
Well, thanks so much. And so one of the points that Rose brings up is that these essentially simulated crises really engage the same decision-making strategies as real-world crises. And so, Andrew, I want to turn the floor over to you to talk about some of your recent wargaming work, which, again, I think is really at the cutting edge of some of this experimental wargaming work. So over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Erik. And just before I start, thank you all four of you played a significant role in nurturing my own research agenda. So it's wonderful to be on a panel with all of you. I should say up front, from my perspective, there are kind of three uses for wargaming methods writ large. So for teaching or pedagogy, for exploration, and for analysis. And my work, like Rose's that you just heard, very much focuses on the latter. And so most recently, the piece that Erik's referencing used wargames as an experimental environment to examine the impacts of specific nuclear capabilities, and in this case, low yield nuclear capabilities, on escalation and likelihood of nuclear use. In the absence, as Rose pointed out, of empirical data, thank goodness, to actually test these problems. This use case was particularly compelling at the beginning of the project, given the fairly vociferous policy debates inspired by the Nuclear Posture Review. And the fact that scholars much smarter than me, here's looking at Vipin Narang and Austin Long, looked at the same information regarding the capability and came to wildly different conclusions about whether they might be stabilizing or destabilizing. And so, of course, there's no empirical data with which to adjudicate their kind of theoretical claims. And so I looked at that and said, well, wargames can maybe play a role here in actually providing some of that data to start thinking about adjudicating that type of theoretical debate. And so what our team had built between Lawrence Livermore, Sandia National Labs, and UC Berkeley was the Signal Wargaming platform very gradually. And so it started off as a tabletop exercise, became a board game that I still think is fantastic to play with graduate students. And then eventually the Signal online game that actually became the test bed for running the experiment. And ultimately, I'm more than happy to talk about the Signal design. It's 1v1v1 multiplayer game. Players are orange, green, or purple, and we can talk about why those colors. And they play on a particular map design, and so all of those types of decisions are really important, but have no place inside of like the academic articles that get published. And so we talk about that kind of thing in our manual and some of the wargaming related outlets as well. But happy to chat about like the design decisions that we're making. And ultimately, we found some support for the idea that low yield capabilities increase the likelihood of nuclear use, and have had a much stronger finding that low yield capabilities actually substitute for high yield nuclear capabilities, all else equal. One of the other things that we did was we validated against the survey experiment as well. Obviously, these are apples and oranges, but they are, like Erik mentioned, both synthetic DGPs. And so, later, kind of when we talk about some of the barriers to publication, that mixed methodness, I think, was really important to actually getting the piece out there into the world.
Well, thanks so much. And I definitely want to come back in a few minutes to talk about all of these design considerations that both Rose and Andrew have alluded to. So who's playing, what do these scenarios look like? And I think that'll be a very kind of fruitful part of the conversation. But before diving into specifics, I think there's this kind of lingering question of what actually is a war game. So I think Reid, Jackie, and I conceive of a war game as having a few dimensions, and it's essentially you're taking players. We can debate how many players one actually needs for a war game to be a war game, and you're going to immerse those players into some kind of realistic scenario where they're going to confront some type of challenge, but they're going to have to follow a set of rules, and there's going to be consequences for their actions. Those consequences might vary depending on what the war game is. So I was wondering if we can, ask both Rose and Andrew, how do you conceive of a war game? Does it align with our definition, or are we totally off? So Rose, I'll start with you on that.
Yeah, I guess I think that you can have a couple different kinds of war games. One is the way that I think the original ones were done during the Vietnam War. Fred Greenstein writes about the original ones that were done with high-level policymakers trying to war game out the outcomes of the Vietnam War, where they actually played red teams and blue teams, and they were real decision makers confronting real decisions that were ongoing at the time. And what was remarkable about those games is that if you look back at them, they actually were incredibly accurate in predicting the outcome of the war. So they showed that the Vietnamese were going to win, but everybody ignored it because they didn't want to believe it, right? And so that was a very realistic scenario, but it didn't have the effect that they wanted. The other way is to do these sort of hypotheticals that we've been talking about, where you have regular people, whether they're policymakers or not, with some hypothetical scenario. So it's not like an actual scenario, like this is what's going on in Ukraine, or this is what's going on in Vietnam, or this is what's going on in Afghanistan. And you have a hypothetical scenario and you try to game it out using a certain number of players and a certain kind of design. I think the challenge from a social scientific perspective is the bigger the number of players, the larger number of players, the more difficult it is to get any control and any traction on actually looking at causal inference and causal patterns. So my initial war games had one person playing one person, and then we aggregated it across the number of dyads we had. But a lot of the military war games I'm aware of, can have hundreds of players, and that can be very useful for looking at, say, Vietnam, because it's a specific circumstance where you want a specific outcome. But you're not going to be able to extract a lot of causal information because there's just too much noise in the system. And so part of what kind of war game you want to do, I think, depends on what your underlying theoretical, empirical, or logistical goal is.
Andrew, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I really liked your definition in the piece, not least because I think it captures the full spectrum of what you might use war games for, from that pedagogical use case to the exploratory use case to the kind of more analytical causal inference use case. And for me as well, war games represent an immersive environment in which players make strategic decisions and have to live, at least for the period that they're in the game, with the consequences of those decisions. So that's kind of my riff on your guys' definition. And I think ultimately these are the traits that set it apart from the alternative synthetic data generating processes, or DGPs, from formal modeling to computer-based simulation and survey experiments, that really are the appropriate comparison for wargaming methods. And then, layered on top of that, all the individual design decisions that you're going to make, right? Is it single player? Is it multiplayer? Is it, player versus scenario? Is it player versus player? Is it analog? Is it online? Is it abstract? Is it not? All of those things kind of come from those characteristics up top. But anytime that you're faced with kind of a behavioral question, I think that those characteristics are the ones that kind of really make it distinct from trying to set up a formal model to explain the scenario of interest. So I think that's kind of my take on it, is kind of, what are the things that make this tool in our toolkit unique versus others? Not to say that we shouldn't be using the others. I'm a big tent person, right? I think we absolutely should be using all the others as well. But I think that one of the nice things about the definition that you set out in the EGIR piece is that it makes clear what those distinctions actually are.
So I actually want to spend another few minutes talking about definitions to make sure we're all kind of on the same page. Then I think we'll dive some more into questions about research design and best practices and the trade-offs that I think scholars and others that are using wargaming need to think about. So the first, Andrew, I think you've used the term data generating process. I also used it and failed to kind of define what I mean by that. But what do we mean by a data generating process and a synthetic data generating process?
Yeah, so I mean, anytime that you're faced with a research question where you want to try to kind of test a theory, you're going to have to draw data from somewhere. Traditionally in political science, we draw it from the world out there, right? And we choose, what are the things out there that are important, and we go ahead and count them and we throw them into a data set. Or alternatively, we use case selection and case design, comparative case study design. But either way, data is being generated for you to test your hypotheses, at least in positivist social science. In terms of synthetic, it's when we can't actually look outside that window and collect that data. And so, as scholars, there's a variety of different ways to address this problem, right? Game theorists might try to say, okay, I want to come up with the most parsimonious explanation for my phenomenon of interest. And oftentimes those can be fairly divorced from the real world phenomenon, if you will, because you have to make so many assumptions about things like rationality of your units or perfect information that, in some contexts, I think make it inappropriate to kind of push onto things like crisis decision making, where, time horizons are short and political leaders may not actually, in fact, operate rationally. But either way, right, whether it's kind of researcher introduced data or in terms of, experimental designs, like experimental wargaming, right? You're getting that data from the players playing the game. But either way, right, to test theory, you need that data to be generated for you to use. And being very clear about where that is that your data is coming from is very important. And from our perspective, right, things like the sample really matter. The kind of the scenario context in which the data is created really matters. So that's kind of my take on it. But no matter which method you're using, there's always the data generating process. Just a question of whether it's coming from the real world or we actually have to create it as scholars.
Perfect. No, I appreciate that clarification. So I think, there's lots of ways that scholars are using war games. There's some really, really exciting research that's happened that we talked about in our last sessions, work by folks like Reid Pauly and John Emery that are using war games as an archival data source. So looking at games that have been run in the past and trying to see what lessons we can learn from that, right? Looking at these war games as a data source. But I think much of the more recent gaming work is actually folks like you, Andrew, that are running war games. And this type of work is happening really in the midst of this experimental turn in international relations scholarship. So Rose, I think you wrote some of the key pieces that really started perhaps this experimental turn in international relations. How do we think about experiments in international relations? I think when people often hear about experiments, we think about lab experiments that scientists are doing to develop vaccines and things like that. But if you could offer us some context about the role of experiments in international relations and political science, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I guess this is one of those moments where I'm like, watch out, you might get what you're after. So in 1999, I submitted one of my very first articles ever to Political Behavior. No, it was AJPS, and it was an experiment. And I got back a letter from the editor with a reject saying, we all know you can't learn anything about political science from experiments. And I was furious because I had been trained in psychology. I really believed in the ability to, generate causal inference from experiments. In one of the few times I've ever done this, I challenged him. It was Greg Caldera, and he said to me, I can send it out for additional reviews, but I can assure you they will be even more negative. And so that's when I started thinking about hey, it's really important to start thinking about the way that this very valuable method, which can actually traction causation in a way that no other method can, should be used and exported for political science. And around that time, Jim Alt at Harvard ran a very small seminar. The year I had an Olin Fellowship with a few of the people who were starting to do experiments in political science. So it was Rick Wilson, some of the more economists, Gary Miller, Gary Bolton, Alan Gerber, who lasted half of one day, and a few other people. Becky Morton was at the second session. There were a few other people, and really started thinking about how to apply experiments to not just political science, but to international relations. It was a much quicker uptake in American politics because the primary concern is voting, and it's much easier to do experiments where a single person is making a single decision, right? And so one of the things that was really interesting and valuable to me about the war game prospect was that it allowed you to actually interrogate this issue of strategic interaction, that Schelling put forward as a critical element in our decision making about international relations, because you could actually look at the interaction. One person makes a decision, another person makes a response or another decision, and there's a sort of interactive element. And that's something you can't do even with other experimental methods like survey experiments or just other kinds of data generating processes like Andrew just so eloquently described. And so I think that there is a real opportunity there within war games to be able to delve into this issue of strategic interaction in a way that you can't with other forms of experimental methodology. That said, I will say I think that there's been an overreach of experiments in political science, particularly the area of field experiments. And I've written recently about the ethical concerns that I have about the large populations who are being impacted without informed consent, without any debriefing, without any concern about the negative impact that can remit to those populations. And so I'm concerned about reeling in some of the more extreme versions of field experiments that affect large populations. That's not so true in war games because it's a much more controlled liberatory experiment. But since you asked for the broader context, I'll say that, you know, I feel like the cat's gotten a little bit too far out of the bag, and I'd like to see more serious consideration of ethical restraints on current field experiments in particular.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I guess the key takeaway there essentially is that experiments offer a bit of traction in trying to manipulate a certain variable of interest and really exploring that causal effect, whether it's on voting outcomes or in the case of war games, perhaps on conflict outcomes or conflict behavior. So Andrew, I was wondering if you can speak a little bit more about your Signal game, right? This is a war game that follows those tenets of war game kind of definition that we talked about, but then integrates elements of experimental design that Rose just laid out for us. So if you can kind of walk us through it at the big conceptual level, really, what does an experimental war game look like? And then I think that provides us with the language that we need to dive into our conversation about war game design.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm going to back my way into it. So not only is there an experimental turn in IR, as you mentioned, but there's also potentially behavioral turn in strategic studies as well, right? And so Wargame is very much at that kind of connection of the Venn diagram. So I'll try to kind of put into context experimental wargaming versus kind of traditional war games, if you will, scare quotes. And they're kind of thinking about the political military war games that Reid was chatting about last week. And so the problems with existing or traditional war games are fairly clear, particularly when it comes to using them for analysis rather than exploration. I'm perfectly happy using traditional seminar-based games to explore a problem space or understand what luminary X or group of luminaries Y thinks might happen in the Donbass or in the Baltic Sea. But it's not really appropriate to draw analytical conclusions from that play, given that they're one-shot in nature. There's often a white cell that influences game behavior, and they're fairly homogeneous player pools. And so, if you're trying to make predictive claims about what's going to happen in the scenario should it play out in the real world, I think you're in real trouble there when you kind of have that kind of traditional setup. But for exploring a problem space, absolutely appropriate, do it all the time. In terms of taking an experimental approach, I think there's some characteristics that are important, right? So first, you're creating a test bed that's replicable, right? That can be used multiple times. We'll have debates forever about how many N is appropriate and how many N is enough. But at the very least, your design needs to be replicable. Players need to be able to plug into it and play through the scenario, absent, right, the game designer being integral in the process. Experiments don't have to, I suppose, but in our case with Signal, right, we really paid a lot of attention to the controlled treatment design and kind of how we kind of implemented that inside the game environment. Ideally, all conditions outside of that controlled treatment distinction are held entirely constant. Basically the players are bringing themselves, their characteristics, and then we're varying that one thing. In our case, we're varying the presence or absence of low yield nuclear capabilities inside the game environment. Finally, we have control over the variables under examination. So for us, right, that control is the military capability that I mentioned, and the game is instrumented or designed for data collection. And this is something that both I and I think Jackie as well have faced challenges with, right? If you have kind of traditional war games, we're really relying there on rapporteurs to capture as much as they possibly can, but probably not everything. And then recording is a wrinkle that sometimes makes some sets of players uncomfortable. And so, thinking really hard about how to do that was something that we spent a lot of time on with Signal. One of the nice things, and then one of the things that we see change as we move from tabletop exercise to board game to online game, is that it's easier and easier to capture all of the data from gameplay, because with an online game, you're getting it all for free. Whereas that's less the case in tabletop, in board games, and then even less the case in tabletops as well. So yeah, I've got lots of stories about rapporteur trainings in my past. But those are the types of things that I think are really important when we think about what constitutes an experimental Wargame, but really it is just bringing experimental design principles, right, and pushing them on top of the wargaming environments that have those characteristics that you guys mentioned in the piece, right? Strategic interaction, consequential decision making, etc.
Yeah, I think that sets us up really nicely for the conversation that's going to follow, right? We're going to talk about things like data capture. What are the best practices for doing that? We're going to talk about, how many iterations one actually needs and kind of what happens across those iterations. Is there a certain end that is enough? But I think at the end of the day, Andrew, as you said, right, experimental war game, you're just manipulating that one variable of interest and really holding everything constant. And in your case, it was whether or not the teams had access to these low yield nuclear weapons. So I actually want to ask if the member of the Hoover IT team, Mike, if you can pull up this eyesore of a chart for just a minute that we'll put up. I don't want people to try to read through everything here. It's available in the article that was posted in the chat. But this is how Reid, Jackie, and I think conceptualize of the game design process. So starting with the research question, right? And in our case, it's something typically dealing with an international relations or security studies question. But one could imagine in the business world, maybe that question is grounded in business processes or business outcomes. Then we think about the sample. So who are the actual players in this game, right? Are we recruiting convenience samples? Are we recruiting experts to play? Then we think about the rules. So, what does the structure of the game look like? How many moves are there? How many sides are there? How are the games adjudicated, right? How do we figure out who wins or loses each round of the game? And then we think very deeply about the scenario. So how abstract or not abstract is a particular scenario? And then as Andrew alluded to, data collection is really, really messy and complicated in many games. And some of the technological solutions that Andrew talked about, right? These online games can help to mitigate some of those issues. But these are the things that I want to, I think, spend the next few minutes talking about to really help folks who are working on war games, whether for academic projects or for other things, to think through. So I want to start with this big question, right? Of, what kinds of questions are best answerable using a war game? So Rose, over to you. Maybe, as both of you are responding, should we think about war games as being useful for answering kind of specific, real world questions, or are they better for answering bigger theoretical things? Both, and kind of how might that affect the design of the game? So Rose.
Well, I think that one of the values of war games is that they can be really flexible to examine all sorts of different things. So to go back to Andrew's earlier categorization, even for pedagogical purposes, one of the real values of war games is that people learn about themselves and they learn about their own decision-making proclivities. And by running through the consequences of it in a hypothetical environment where the consequences may not be real, although they may feel real, they may learn like, oh, if I'm in that real situation, I don't want to behave that way. Or, gee, this other person did this thing and it worked out really great. And so I think that one of the real values is you learn about your own decision-making propensities, proclivities, and so on. From the other perspective of, analysis or exploration, I think that they can be very valuable to help generate hypotheses that can later be tested either using experimental models or formal models or other kinds of things that can be used that way. And so from that perspective, it can be quite valuable. And I think that there's ways in which war games can be extremely useful, again, for scenarios where we want to know something about the future, but it's either unethical or impossible logistically to figure out how to do that. So, I love the chart you have. I think it's really great and it's really comprehensive. I think it's a really accurate and appropriate way to think about it. But you start with the question, like, what is your research question? And some of these questions are going to be big and some of them are going to be small. And that's going to direct the future structure of the way that the actual game evolves. But I think sometimes those questions are about illuminating decision-making processes, and sometimes those questions are about larger outcomes in the real world in international relations. And depending on which of those focuses it is, the structure of the game may be quite different.
Thanks so
I'm
much.
not sure that addresses exactly your question, but.
No, it really does. And I actually want to bring in Jackie for a minute here before going over to Andrew. So Jackie, you run this really interesting series of war games on international crisis games. But as you were thinking about kind of this question that you were going to ask, first tell us what the question was, and then can you walk us through the decision-making process that you had in your mind that led you to adopt a experimental game versus a more traditional war game?
Yeah, so our International Crisis War Games series was developed to look at a very rare phenomenon, which is, would cyber operations lead to nuclear use? And we wanted specifically to look at how cyber vulnerabilities in nuclear command, control, and communications could lead to decisions to, for example, preemptively use nuclear weapons. And then secondarily, we were interested, if we give somebody an exploit, are they actually going to use it? But this is actually not something we can test with real world data, right? Both it's classified and, I mean, luckily these nuclear scenarios don't happen very often. So war games gave us the opportunity to look at this question. And the other thing I think that led us to war games was that, I'm very inspired by Rose's work, and I inherently think that it's human behaviors about technology that we as social scientists can have leverage over. And that's what games really help us understand. I'm not going to tell you what the outcome of a campaign is necessarily, but maybe by running games over time, we can get insights about patterns of human behaviors. And so that's what I wanted to understand. So we ran this game. The real question for us as we designed this experimental game, we ended up having 4 groups. We had a control group, and then we had 3 other groups that had variations of this treatment of vulnerabilities and exploits. And our big question as we entered the game was, how many people do we need to run the game? We were watching Andrew and his team run Signal, which had this huge amount of data. And then most of the other work that was being done was actually either kind of one game iteration or very small iterations. So we ended up running with about 580 players. We ran in groups of 5, so that was about 115 different teams. It was over 3 years, and that sample started out extremely expert and elite. And then as the sample became larger, we became more interested in heterogeneity within the sample. And so we actually expanded out, which gave us great leverage to understand whether college students are going to act differently than defense ministers. Spoiler, they actually don't act that differently on core things, just at the margin. So we had to make a series of different decisions about how much realism versus abstraction, how we were going to generate data. And I think there are a few things we really learned. One is, we were really interested in large numbers, but the reality was we got very little variance after kind of a certain number. So it all I think we could actually run the game with much less people and more focus on specific attributes of the sample. And then the other big thing that we noticed was that we were very interested in generating data that was rather quantitative. So my dependent variable. And we used surveys to help understand, and we used crisis response plans. But then when we came to write the paper, the most interesting tidbits were in where people just filled in information. And so I think as researchers design these games, they need to think not only about how do I generate sample and how do I create power and how do I make sure that I have control and treatment, but also allowing for that thing that is unique about games, which is how people interact, the kind of irrationalities about how we as humans deal with these complicated phenomena. That's what games do that you really don't get in survey experiments. So as a researcher, I think you have to find ways to account for and allow for both these really interesting qualitative tidbits and the quantitative that allow you to better kind of characterize larger patterns.
So Andrew,
can I jump in on that, Erik?
Absolutely.
So I love that answer, Jackie. And it just reminds me, the very first series of war games I ran, I actually did at Cornell, with paper and pencil, kids. And did a lot of debriefing afterwards. And one of the most amazing things that was really insightful is how much information you get out of that kind of debriefing. And sometimes it's stuff they write down, but you can also talk to them afterwards, right? And so I remember one case, they could tie, and they got something really valuable for them, which was extra credit, which could actually bump their grade from like an A- to an A, which is a really big deal, you know, in an undergraduate population. And there were a bunch of ties, but all the ties, I was looking at sex differences. So all the ties were girls who would tie and the boys wouldn't tie, right? And so I was talking to 3 sets of 2 men in each of the groups where they would have tied, and then at the last minute, one of them just blew the other one to smithereens, right? And so I was like, what were you thinking? Did you just decide you didn't care about the extra credit? Did you already have an A and so it didn't matter? And every one of them said some version of to me of the following statement, which was, I knew I could have had a tie. I really needed the extra credit. I really wanted that outcome, but I knew if I destroyed him, it would just feel so good. And that was the thing that where I was like, what is that feeling? Like, what is generating that feeling? And that's actually what started the whole inquiry into the hormone stuff, right? Was like, what is that feeling? What generates that feeling that makes you do something that you know rationally isn't in your best interest, but that you're privileging this, you know, experience over some valuable outcome. And so, you know, that's the other value of war games, is because when we were looking at hormones, you could look at stuff in real time over time. So like you did it over 3 years, you can actually look at how people change over time, and that becomes a variable of interest in and of itself. And so I think that what you did there is really great, but also provides a lot of insight for other people who are interested in looking at change over time or change in real time, because that's what war games allow you to do. Sorry, Erik, I didn't mean to cut in.
No, that was actually a really helpful, you know, I think statement to kind of bring us to the next portion of the conversation. And that brings us this notion of the sample, right? So Rose says that these college students are, you know, maybe behaving in a way that is a little bit different, perhaps, than real world decision makers, but maybe they're not, right? So I think one of the things that all researchers think about when they're running a project, whether it's a survey experiment, a lab experiment, is this notion of sample, right? And what should that sample look like? So Andrew, I was wondering if you can share some thoughts with us about your work. You've obviously run the Signal game and many of the associated projects on very different types of samples. So what are some of the debates right now in political science surrounding the value of different types of samples? And then if you can talk to us a little bit about the challenges of getting, you know, certain types of samples versus others, and then we'll build from there.
Yeah. So first off, this is the bone of contention in the field. We use sampling techniques that kind of run the gamut from, you know, trying to find the most senior policymakers who played a tabletop version of Signal that we could, all the way down to Amazon Mechanical Turk, right? With undergraduate psychology labs, and then play events with early career, so kind of young professionals between the kind of the 25 to 40, you know, from the academic side, that would be postdocs. Inside of government, that might be something like GS 11 to 12, right? But a little bit more expert, if you will. And so, you know, we try to kind of capture across the spectrum in terms of play. Of course, if you could get the actual decision maker in the room to play a particular war game or a particular scenario, that would be fantastic. With that said, though, we shouldn't assume that a current policymaker or the former policymakers that we often use as proxies for real policymakers are actually going to behave the same way inside your synthetic environment that they would in the real world. I think that's a conceit of, you know, wargaming methods writ large. You know, as researchers, you know, we often do our best, and Erik, you know, I look at your work, right, to replicate lead samples, right, by trying to draw on PME, for example, right, and get you know, folks to actually engage with your research that come from those types of backgrounds. But, you know, obviously how well it's going to go really depends on your research question, how sensitive it is, et cetera. You know, for what it's worth, you know, we had a bit of a back and forth in science with your colleagues at Rand around this point. And, I think their position was you needed to have elites, and our position is, well, that's probably true, but we don't have any data to test that proposition. I'm fairly sympathetic to the idea that there could be a distinction between elite versus non-elite play, but we don't have data to actually make that kind of argument in settled fact. And so that's one laboratory effect among many. I think broadly, when you look at the board games and the TTXs for Signal and also some of the other game designs, I think that I see a lot of what Jackie sees in terms of, ultimately players are playing the game that's put in front of them. They're facing this strategic dilemma. It's like, sure, the language that people are using might be different. I would say also students care a little bit less about how their colleagues think of them. Senior policymakers, they care a lot about what the most senior person in the room thinks. And so that's something that's worth kind of teasing out as well. But ultimately, I think this is some of the work that needs to happen inside the academy in this space, which is to actually, try to adjudicate and unpack this in a war game setting. Obviously, Josh Kurtzer, right, has his own argument pulling on survey work, right? And he also, right, argues that elite versus non-elite isn't as significant a distinction. Of course, we could also have an entire panel talking about the definition of eliteness as well.
Well, thanks so much. I actually want to bring Reid Pauly into this conversation. In some of your archival work, you've seen differences in behavior between those folks that are actually in government and those that are brought in just to play for the day that maybe don't have government experience. I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that, Reid.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So I've had the opportunity, an exciting research experience of finding in the archives records of these early political military war games, some of which Rose was talking about in her remarks, but even before the Vietnam games were played, it was Thomas Schelling and Lincoln Bloomfield running games both outside in an unclassified setting at MIT, and then also being asked to come into the Pentagon to run classified games as game directors as the Pentagon was setting up its Joint War Games Control Group that became the Joint War Games Agency. And this is in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And they ran games throughout the 60s. But in a sense, these are as elite a war game as you can run. This almost feels like when you're reading the documents that it's a time before the tyranny of the inbox, right? When you could actually get very senior policymakers sitting in a room together for an entire day, debating, what to do if the Soviets attempt to invade West Berlin, right? And they're doing it in a structured, strategic gaming sense, but they're also doing it in a way that conforms with Schelling's design of the game to try and get them to signal their interests and resolve and capabilities to the other side that's sitting in the room across the hall, and then trying to get a sense of who has effectively signaled, who is going to get their way in the crisis, whose signals are being misperceived and whatnot. The finding that Erik is referring to, right, is that we can take all these games with elites in them and count the number of times in games when they were allowed to use nuclear weapons, when they decided not to use nuclear weapons, and out of a sample of 26 games or so, in only 2 of them did the elite policymakers choose to use nuclear weapons. And even in that case, maybe I'll post the article in the chat if people are interested, but even in that case, it's a little fuzzy about whether they really meant to use nuclear weapons or if control team did it for them. But the point is to compare it then to when these same designed games, the same method was used, but with different players. And there was an instance where this happened. As far as I know, it's only happened the one time, but the Pentagon invited were called like business leaders, executives, and some celebrities in for essentially like a public relations tour, and they played this game with them. And suffice it to say, they were much more likely to use nuclear weapons than the elites, policymakers were when they played the games. And you can see this also in slightly different methods that were used, but by other scholars who tried run games in a undergraduate setting where they seem to go result in thermonuclear war slightly more. So you might at least think that if it comes to certain research questions about specialty expertise like nuclear strategy, maybe the sample size or sample elite or convenience matters more to specific niche questions like nuclear strategy. And I want to make just one more point about this, right? Some of these players were cabinet level, right? Some of these players were, like the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, John McNaughton. And the way I just think about this, right, is that if you want to run a war game and get an average treatment effect to try and understand, what a policymaker might do in a hypothetical circumstance, right? If you're talking about what a policymaker might do in the 1960s or recommend, you don't really want the average treatment effect if you can get the treatment effect on John McNaughton, right? Like the actual policymaker there making the choices and telling you in a war game what they might recommend or not. Schelling designed it this way and was able with his convening power to get folks like this to participate, but he very explicitly did not ask and never wanted a president to play his games. He did not believe that the president of the United States should be put in a position to answer questions about a hypothetical crisis, lest he be signaling his intent in the real world. Excellent question. Thanks.
So I think this Wargame, sir, go ahead, Andrew.
Sorry, just a two finger. So in the last week's discussion, right, the end got kind of short shrift, particularly in the lightning round. And just to note that with regards to kind of Reid's issue here, the large N actually solves some of that problem, right? When your question is like, how does a treatment impact nuclear use? If you get lots of N, it's not necessarily about an individual using nuclear weapons or not. It's given the experimental condition, are nuclear weapons used more or less like, is nuclear weapons use more or less likely? And if you assume that there's a universal distribution, right, of errorness in your sample, if it's large enough, law of large numbers, right, you're able to actually say like, hey, we think that this capability, right, moves the needle. And that's kind of one of the things that you're getting with N here.
Yeah, so I think there's lots of really, really interesting debates here, right? The eliteness of the sample and what actually is elite. Do I need senior leaders? Can I use a proxy, so more junior folks? And then also the number of respondents. But there's one question that actually comes from a member of the audience that I think is really important. And it gets back to Reid's point about, who these individuals are representing. So in many war games that are two-sided, we have, blue, the United States, going up against a rival red power. So maybe red is Russia, maybe red is China, North Korea, whomever. And so how do we think about recruiting players to play red, right? We can't obviously ask Putin to play himself in a war game. I don't have the resources to do that. I think he's got other things that are on his mind right now. But how should we think about that type of impact on a game? So actually, I'll go over to Jackie for that. I know this is something that you've thought about.
The red play is really extremely difficult. So I think as a researcher, you're making a choice. Am I collecting information about a particular scenario, right? Do I care about what's going to happen in Russia, Ukraine? Or is this kind of more generally how I think humans are going to behave? And I actually think as political scientists, it's a little bit easier to run the abstract phenomenon than the real world phenomenon. And I want to say, as somebody who's worked in kind of DoD wargaming, I think sometimes we put too much credit actually in getting the right players in reds. Maybe I'm like being a little bit divisive here, because I think very rarely do we actually understand the insights that red has. And so personally, I would prefer, and this is something I think that many people in the Naval War College might disagree with me on, I would prefer iteration to understand kind of what are the possibilities than to try and get the perfect red team and then say, well, based on that perfect sample, I think red is going to do X, Y, and Z. Anecdotally, I ran a game where I was very insistent on having a red team, and then because I wanted to be realistic, and those jerks didn't play the way I wanted them to play at all, and I lost complete control over the game. So personally, I actually think we put almost too much emphasis on the red, but I think if I am concerned about, like for my cyber game, 580 players from all over the world, but not really, because I had trouble finding players from China and Russia. So when I talk to a practitioner and I say, here are the implications of my findings, I'm very clear to say, we had international players, but 70% of them are American. And the 30% that were not were either from South America, Europe, or they're generally not from Russia or China. If I want to say something specifically about what Russia and China are thinking, then it's very important that I'm using the sample from Russia and China. And in that way, you're dealing with the same kind of problems that people with survey experiments deal with in terms of sample generation and trying to extrapolate specific country foreign policy decisions versus general human reactions to international crises.
That was fantastic, and I think offers us an ability to shift the conversation to these questions about iteration and abstraction, right? And Jackie has mentioned her game pretty significantly, so I don't know if we can drop the link to your simulations and gaming article into the chat. I think that'd be helpful for some of the viewers. So I want to step back and think about experimental design, wargame design. One of the key trade-offs that researchers make is about this idea of abstraction. So how similar do we want a scenario or an experiment to be to the real world? So do we want it to perfectly simulate a real world event and be externally valid? Or do we want to maybe have a little bit more abstraction? In that way, maybe things aren't as detailed. Maybe we don't list specific country names, but that perhaps gives researchers a little bit more experimental control, the ability to control the vignette in a way that has internal validity. So Rose, I was wondering if you can walk us through the distinction between external validity and internal validity. I know I often need a refresher. And so we'll start with that, and then we'll open up the conversation a little bit more broadly.
Yeah, thanks, Erik. I'm happy to do that, although I think that your question's actually also getting at this issue about how realistic you want your games to be. So I might touch on that as well. External validity is the thing that political scientists obsess about, and basically comes down to how generalizable is it to the larger population? And so most political scientists think that the way around that problem is to just have larger and larger and larger sample sizes, right? 100,000 people in your sample or whatever, and that gives it external validation. That can definitely increase your generalizability, but that's only true if the experiment also already has internal validity, which means, are you actually studying, testing the thing that you say that you're studying or testing? So I'll give a really simple example. The early get out the vote experiments had conditions where they would go to people's houses and talk to them about whether or not they're going to vote. And this was done in New Haven. And what would happen is they'd go and they'd talk to people. And if people weren't there, they would go back the next day. And if they weren't there, they would just code them as, I didn't talk to that person. But there's a huge difference, especially in a city like New Haven, between the kinds of people who are home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and the kinds of people who aren't home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right? I mean, it has a lot to do with employment status. So, but then it gets coded as exactly the same. And so you're not actually studying the thing that you say that you're studying, right? Which is whether or not you had contact with someone. And so if you are not actually having the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable that you say that you're studying, it doesn't matter how many people you're studying, it's like garbage in, garbage out. There's nothing that you learn from that. So internal validity, which is the thing that psychologists obsess about, is all about the actual internal design of the experiment. Are you actually manipulating a variable in a systematic way that allows you to test the question under investigation in a systematic way that shows the connection between the independent variable and the dependent variable? From there, you can increase your samples. The way that psychologists do it is actually not to increase the sample size on a single experiment, which is what political scientists do. What they do is many, many, many replications of an experiment where they'll change, say, the population, they'll change the context, they'll change different aspects of it to look at the scope conditions. And it's the replication of those experiments across variant scope conditions that to them equilibrates to generalization. That's very, very different than the way that political scientists understand generalization, which is just, I have 100,000 people, it's an awesome experiment, right? Now, the other issue here, which I think Erik raises, is the issue related to, do you have naive realism or experimental realism in the actual experiment that you're running? So you can have all the bells and whistles so that it looks like what it would look like to make that real experiment. But if you're not engaging psychologically the subjects in the actual decision you care about, it doesn't matter. So my favorite example here is the phenomenal Shanto Iyengar experiment on ads that he ran when he was at UCLA, where he wanted to look at the effect of negative advertising on people's decision-making about voting for particular candidates. And he set up these living rooms in shopping malls in LA, including TVs. And they were supposed to watch the ad and then, give the feedback. And what happened was he did what everybody has in their living room, and he had, remote control, right? So people sat down, the negative ad came on, they changed the channel. So he actually lost his whole stimulus. So he had to take away the remote. He had to take away an aspect of naive realism in order to get at what he really wanted to get at, which was to engage the subjects in the actual process he cared about, which was their reaction to the ad. But he needed their attention on in the ad in order to be able to do that. And I think that's one of the real failings in a lot of the experiments that are often done, is that they fail to actually psychologically engage the subjects in the dynamic mechanism that we're interested in exploring. If you can do that, it doesn't matter what any of the bells and whistles look like. And I'll give you an example of that. When I first ran the experiments that I did in Cornell, I had these, like I said, simulated war games. They were in classrooms, paper and pencil. There was no computer. There were no visual images. There were no maps. I mean, it was like no part of it looked like a real experience. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, I went to give a talk at a dorm, a frat, actually late at night. And I come in and there's this enormous room, and the whole room, it was like 40 by 40, was covered with butcher block all over everywhere with, lines and squirrels, squiggles and numbers and whatever pictures. And I said to the guy, I was like, what is this? And he's like, what do you mean, what is this? This is your experiment. And I said, what? They had been playing the experiment for 3 weeks after they left my classroom because they found the fight so engaging, right? No bells and whistles, but it psychologically engaged them in a form of competition they found interesting, right? And so that's what I mean. Like, if you can psychologically engage the process, it doesn't matter what the externals look like, but simultaneously you can have the most fancy, expensive, realistic surroundings. And if they're checking their phone and they're thinking about their, mother who's sick and their kid who doesn't like them and, their brother who just died of an opioid overdose, you ain't got nothing, right? And so you have to understand what that baseline is going in order to engage the process that matters to you. And obviously, I feel pretty passionately about this because I've made a lot of these mistakes and I've seen, a lot of these mistakes, and it's very hard to design a protocol that engages people, but that's the value of pilot testing, even with games, is to actually try it out and see if people care. Can you distract them? And if you can distract them, you can do better. If you can't distract them, then you've got a pretty good baseline.
Those I think are really, really important lessons. And I think all war game designers are thinking about how to draw people in, right? So some folks right now are using in your language, Rose, kind of bells and whistles with virtual reality sensors. Others are trying to draw them in with scenarios that are perhaps incredibly intriguing. So Andrew, I want to ask you to describe how you think about this challenge in the war games that you've designed, and then to talk a little bit about in this process about abstraction, right? I think that's part of this decision-making process. You're trying to figure out, how do I make this realistic in a way to draw people in?
Fantastic. Yeah. So I'll give you the in theory and then the in practice answers. So, we have a piece in an edited volume that Frank Smith and Nina Kohlers and Ben Schechter are putting together, where we kind of describe a simplex, right? A triangular simplex with kind of analytical utility at one axis, contextual realism on the other axis, and then engaging play on the other. And again, when you're comparing it against the other synthetic generating processes, I think the fantastic thing about wargaming is that actually we can calibrate as designers where you want to fall inside that triangle, right? So we have some games that, maximize engaging play, but make analysis very difficult to do, right? Of course, ideally, you want to live slap bang in the middle of that simplex, right? And be able to pull all of the analytical, goodness out of it, right? Whilst also mirroring the real world dynamics that you think are important, whilst also creating an environment that players are sutured into, right? As Rose just discussed. And so, that's what we spend a lot of time thinking about when we're doing initial design, and then, have an alpha version, perform beta testing, et cetera, which is, central to actually, getting a game that's playable on the back end. In practice, I think, like Jackie, I tend towards abstract scenarios rather than using real world countries, particularly when we're relying on American subject matter experts to play the role of a Russia or a China or North Korea. Again, there's not settled scholarship on this point, but I'd be very worried that it's an American's view of what Russia would do in a particular scenario. So that mirror imaging concern is significant. And just to give you an anecdote, when we were actually going through this beta testing phase with Signal, initially, like any other good war game, we had blue and we had red. And as soon as we had red, we saw a whole bunch of escalate to de-escalate, because players were just assuming that they were Russia, and that's what they should do because through what the Gerasimov doctrine says, or at least what American policymakers think that it says. And so that's a big problem, right? If your questions has nothing to do with that particular context and is more about, in general, when I add a nuclear capability, what's going to happen? And so, that's something that, is really problematic. It also drives map design. So not only player colors, right? But, our initial designs had a country kind of off to the left that was an island, and then two other countries down on the bottom right that were contiguous to one another. And players said Russia, Europe, America. And that's, again, not what we want them to do, right? And that's what drives the player color choices and the map choices inside of Signal, right? To try to get us as far away from that context as possible, because we're not interested in that particular dynamic. We're interested in generalized theorizing around when nuclear use is more or less likely given a capability set. Which is, again, not to say that if you were exploring the Baltic Sea or the Black Sea, that having, a map with hexes overlaid and, little, pieces stolen from Monopoly and Risk, right, isn't appropriate. It absolutely is, but it's for exploration in a specific instance, not for generalized like IR insights. And so, I agree with Jackie. It's much easier for us as political scientists because we're interested in the general rule rather than the specific.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I think one of the key themes that's really emerging from this conversation is that every single design choice involves some kind of inherent trade-off, right? Mm-hmm. You're either going to have an elite sample that is going to be able to replicate perhaps very closely to the decision-making, cognitive ability of the folks that are actually making decisions, but they're going to be really hard to get. You might have a convenient sample that's easier to get, but perhaps you have some loss in realism. And the same goes with the degree of abstractness, right? The lessons that you're able to generalize are going to be different from a game that is very precise. So, one of the things that I think many social scientists will push for is this notion of an increased number of iterations or repetitions of a game, right? To help build up essentially the number of games so you can perhaps see trends over the course of several games. This is obviously, as Andrew, you mentioned, something that is up for debate. Some people say, well, should we do many iterations of games with perhaps a convenient sample, or do we do smaller numbers of games played by elites? So, Rose, from an experimental standpoint, you talked a little bit about the difference between psychologists and political scientists when it comes to this, but wondering if you might be able to share some of your thoughts on kind of maybe what's better at the end of the day.
I'm not sure it's better. I think it depends on what your research question is. So to go back to the earlier discussion we had about whether it's better to have elites or regular people, and Jackie's work and some of Josh Kurtzer's work shows that they're not that different. But I think a lot of it has to do with what you're asking. So I imagine in some areas they're quite different, and in other areas they're the same. So if you think about like psychology, I don't need elites if I'm doing a subject on vision. Anybody who has a healthy eye is a reasonable subject for me, right? But if I'm looking at elite decision making, then it may be more helpful to have an elite person. And I think Reid's example here speaks well to this example of, in the historical war games, celebrities and others may be more likely to engage in nuclear war just because they think of it in more like a gaming terms, really as something that's fun and that's interesting, and they want to make it lively and they want to make it engaging, and they don't really think through the consequences in the same way that a real decision maker who maybe has confronted questions like that or had to think about questions like that would. And so, with regard to the way that experiments are run in political science versus psychology, and economics has its own way of doing stuff too, right? Like they come up with a formal model, and then they do an experiment, and then they adjust the formal model, and then they run it, through a simulation. So there's different ways of doing these things. And I think that, like with anything else, it really should be driven by your theoretical question. And one of the concerns that I have, and this is probably just because I'm old, but I see the entire field of political science moving much more in this direction of like how fancy your methods are, with no concern about what the theoretical question is. And I think that they should be driven by what is your substantive question, and then pick the method that works best for it, rather than I have this, King Kong method, and I'm going to show how I'm this stats, God, and it doesn't really matter that what I show is that, I don't recognize the person who moved in next door, and so who cares, right? And so I think that there should be a privileging of a particular kind of theoretical insight, careful design of the protocol around the research question, and then picking the particular method, whether it's interviews or war games or formal models or quantitative analysis that fits the question, rather than do what I see increasingly, which is pick the method and then find a canned data set and then figure out what your results are and then backdoor the question. And I read like, I review 8 pieces a month that are like that, and they just drive you insane, right? Because it's clear what the motive and the incentive is, which is I need publications for tenure. But the insight into anything that matters for something in the real world is zero. And so, we have this real disconnect between the incentives of the institutional system and the ostensible goals, which is to provide some kind of meaningful insight into the real world. And I know that sounds really cynical, but, like I said, I'm old.
Well, that's fantastic, and I think opens the door for a whole other set of conversations about career incentives in academia and maybe research more broadly. But Andrew, I'm just wondering how you weigh these trade-offs in the design of your games, because you've had multiple iterations, different platforms. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think for me, it's really important to have that variety of game type that's asking the same kind of theoretical question that gives you the different audiences or players for your game, right? So, from my perspective, if you build a really fancy experimental war game that's hosted online, you still get the tabletop exercise for free. You should use that. You should take that to the Beltway. And play it through with sets of players who might not be comfortable kind of playing with your, fancy online setting. So that's kind of one way to do it. I think that, obviously for us, we were kind of stabbing in the dark in terms of coming up with our N for our work, because we didn't really have anything to compare it to, right? Like, I think the best data set was Reid's, right, where you had different games inside the data set. So it wasn't even the same game played multiple times, when we were doing this work. Ultimately, we ended up with 1,500 players, just over 500 games. I think that broadly, I agree with Jackie that there were diminishing returns to what the N+1 buys you analytically. And I think that looking back, I would have much rather tweaked some of the secondary RQs that we could have asked and answered with the project rather than garnering that much N. So for example, right, our nuclear dyads are symmetrical. Well, that's really interesting for peer and near peer cases, but if you're interested in asymmetrical competition in the nuclear space, right, we could have tested that by taking away some of the N from our symmetrical dyad. And I think we would have got more oomph from doing that. But what I will say is that, and Stacey Pettyjohn's exercises have done this from RAND and now CNAS, right? Having the social science principles behind even exploratory games allow you to port it over later should you actually wish to garner more N. And so I think that's the useful thing as well, right? So even if I'm building an exploratory game, and I actually did this with Heather Williams at King's College, right? It had an experimental setup, even though our N was like 10, right? But it still allowed us to say something along the lines of, hey, when the players had this treatment, the conversations look different in these ways amongst luminary X, Y, or Z. And I think that's really valuable, right? Like, it doesn't rise to the level of statistical significance, certainly wouldn't impress anybody in the journals that Rose is talking about, but, right, it's something really, you can still do it in an exploratory setting. And I think that's a really useful thing to think about as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. So both Andrew and Rose, your last round of responses, I think, bring up this broader set of questions about how we as researchers should characterize the findings of wargames, and then how we should think about publishing them and getting this information out to a broader audience. So one of the audience members raises a really good question, essentially saying that, are wargames limited in the sense, do players just say, oh, it's a game, I'm going to act in the way that I'm going to act because it's a game? So how do we think about perhaps potential limitations like that as we frame and design our research? And then, how do we appeal to reviewers, right? Rose, you brought up this great example early on, how some reviewers at the American Journal of Political Science told you several years ago that you can't learn anything about politics from an experiment. And I think many folks that are using wargaming today get that same kind of reaction from reviewers who say that this isn't really a known methodology. So I know it's a broad kind of meandering question. Maybe there wasn't a question there, but would love both of your thoughts on both how we characterize the limitations of our results and how we should convince reviewers that this work is worth publishing. So over to Rose first. I know you've both submitted this and also served on several editorial boards.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is what the purpose is. So Andrew just raised a really good point. If you're not trying to publish this work, if you're just doing it as like in-house stuff for your government job and you don't need to publish it, then the incentive structures are slightly different. If you do need to publish it, then I think that the important thing is to figure out ways to tie the game to ongoing theoretical debates in the field so that you broaden the potential audience of people that would be interested in it, who may not share the methodology, but are very, very interested in the substantive topic. And the other is, it's just a matter of kind of, banging your head against the wall for a lot of years. So nobody does experiments, and then pretty soon there's too many experiments. Not pretty soon, it's 20 years, but you get my point. So some of it is just keeping at it, but I think a lot of it is actually tying it to substantive questions of interest to broader audiences, and then saying, here's this novel way to investigate it, rather than forwarding the method, because then that could put people off who either don't understand the method or who don't like the method. And I also, think that the other thing that's just important to say is which journals you target really matter. There's going to be some journals that are much more receptive to this than other journals. There's going to be some journals that just are not going to be interested in novel methods like this. And so thinking seriously about which journals you send it to, particularly if you have a time constraint, like I don't have 3 years to wait or whatever. So you don't want to go through multiple journals that are going to reject it before. And then I'll say one final thing for people who maybe are very interested in this, but either have tenure or have come up for tenure, which is that there's lots of places you can publish this stuff that's not in political science. And the upside of that is that you actually engage an audience of people who are interested in the method or perhaps interested in the topic. And you can come up with very interesting collaborations and have very interesting conversations with people you wouldn't have encountered otherwise, because you're actually reaching them from their own journals rather than expecting them to be reading yours. Now, for some people, that's not going to work for tenure, but for others, it may not be as important, or they have enough publications in other areas, or their departments are more liberal about what counts. And then publishing in a journal like Games and Simulations can really help, because then it's going to broaden the audience and open up other possibilities that you might not have thought about when people reach out and say, hey, I saw this piece and I'm doing this thing and maybe we can talk. And so, to the extent that that's a possibility, it's really a wonderful opportunity if you have the freedom and flexibility within your own institutional incentives and constraints to reach out and do it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think Rose is spot on, right? Policy relevance hooked into theoretical debates. I think also another thing that certainly that my team has done is, mixed methods research, right? Pull in the survey experiments that are more normal in the field, right? And use that to, introduce the method. And I think that was one of the nice things about the JPR piece. In terms of the kind of the back portion of the audience question, I think there's a really important point for those of us that use war games in our research to make. And there's this oft-used criticism that war games are kind of made up and thus not reliable. But I think that criticism kind of misses the point, not least because it's just as true of survey experiments or formal models and computer-based simulations, and where empirical data is unavailable, right? So that's the bar. The bar isn't like, where's this data coming from, right? Is it providing unique insights vis-a-vis these other alternatives? And my answer when you've got a behavioral question is yes, because I can't assume things like perfect rationality, and I can't assume things like perfect information that we often do inside of those contexts. I mean, obviously, if we all had the empirical data, then we would use it, we'd answer the question and we'd be done, right? But to be quite frank, a lot of the policy relevant questions that we ask in things like War on the Rocks, right, or the quarterly, there are no empirics for like, should I build a delivery system X, Y, or Z? Should I, have strategy A, B, or C? We don't have the empirics for it. So it's, you're creating best substitutes for, and in that sense, for me, it's a pretty attractive tool, again, within that broader toolkit for us to pick up and use.
Thanks so much. So we've gotten the whole kind of gamut from starting to think about a war game, how should we design a war game, and then how should we think about publishing a war game. So what I want to do in the last 10 minutes or so is to transition to a lightning round where I'm actually going to ask Jackie and Reid to join in a little bit. So I'll ask a question to all of you, and you'll basically get a no more than 2-sentence answer. And I think it's a nice way of bringing this all together. But the first question for the lightning round, and I'll start with Jackie first on this, is if an organization could grant you unlimited resources to improve wargaming, what would it be?
Ooh, either an archive of wargaming data or a place where we could give samples and party planning to all the researchers that want it. Because that's the really hard thing about getting into war games, is all the money and time it takes to throw the party that is a game.
Perfect. So a center that would support and allow researchers to come in and run war games. Andrew.
A sandbox for war game designers to quickly iterate and field war games.
Rose.
Yeah, I really like Jackie's answer. I think that for me, it would be setting up training sessions for graduate students and junior scholars, like as a short summer institute, to not only train people how to do it, but to establish collaborations between those who are starting to work on such topics.
Oh, that's awesome. And Reid.
I love those. I like both Jackie and Rose's. I especially want to double tap the archival one suggestion, which also involves filing a lot of FOIAs and mandatory declassification reviews.
Can war games be used beyond the defense realm? Jackie.
Yes. I
Andrew.
think we often use war games to generate the data that we're interested in, which is generally international security. But if you look, games are wonderful for understanding anything that doesn't happen normally. So environmental issues, actually games are used in a lot of formats actually in American political science that we don't call them war games, we call them something else.
Andrew.
100% yes. Anytime you have a behavioral problem where we have an RQ and need to rely on synthetic data, we should go for it. The business case for me looms large, thinking about the legacy of shell scenario planning and current efforts to understand geopolitical risk inside of major firms.
Yeah, so absolutely. And, you know, they don't call them war games in psychology, but they do these exact war games to look at mating behavior. So relationship status and mating behavior. And it's very useful if depressing.
Reid.
Yes, 100%. War games will reveal mistakes in your planning, your assumptions, your thinking that you didn't even know were there in any sector.
Perfect. And I'll do this as the last one. So what's the most important thing we can gain from war games? Jackie.
Oh no, you can't go. The most important thing we can get from war, I think it's, for me, I'm inherently a behavioralist. I believe the human behaviors are the most interesting phenomenon to understanding how the world works. And so I think that's what games provide, is a really unique and important way to understand human behaviors. That was a total cop-out of an answer, but there you go.
Andrew.
Mine riffs on Jackie's, a new understanding of behavior that doesn't hide behind the math.
Oh, that's awesome. Rose?
I think that the most important thing that can be gained, and it's not clear it will be gained, is a reduction in the risk of nuclear war.
That's what we need in the world today, right?
I feel like Rose just like one up to all of us. This is like, oh, of course, yeah. Like the win should be like not going to nuclear war. I don't know why I didn't think of that.
No, but I mean, I think that because when you think about things that you don't want to have happen, and yet you don't have data on it, how do you simulate how to deal with this? And, you know, with regard to pandemic disease, they did a lot of this in the CDC during the Clinton and W administrations. And then it was completely eviscerated when Trump came into office. And you think about how you could have actually prevented 1 million deaths now in America, maybe not 1 million, but, you know, if we were at the level of Japan, we would have had 50,000 deaths, not 1 million. And that could have been prevented precisely through the use of war games that they ran in the CDC, you know, in earlier administrations during their pandemic control group that was eliminated. And so I think that when we think about what we can get out of war games, it's not just, you know, I think about nuclear war, but pandemic disease. I mean, lots of things where you learn how to prevent mistakes that you wouldn't otherwise because you haven't thought about it before.
To basically get a test drive without as significant of the consequences of facing these things in the real world. And Reid, this means you get the last word on this. So over to you.
Well, I want to do a two-finger quick on Rose's point of a piece in foreign policy that explored this a little bit. And one of the issues with that Trump transition, right, was that they actually did play something that maybe Andrew would call exploratory or educational, right, as a kind of seminar discussion of pandemic preparedness. But then it was the if you'd like to think that it was successful or useful as an exercise during the transition, it was completely eviscerated by the turnover in the Trump administration upon arrival, right? So like the first national security advisor who would have presumably played in that exercise lasts like 3 weeks, right? So you don't end up having the transfer of knowledge that exercise was supposed to do. I was going to end it on a similar theme, which is that war games can give us a more peaceful world. It's somewhat ironic to the name war games. When some people are unfamiliar, they feel like it is hawkish exercise or something, but the point of simulating this level of conflict ahead of time so that it does not happen in the real world.
Well, thanks for that positive end note. I think that's what we need a lot more of in the world today. I want to thank Dr. Andrew Reddy and Dr. Rose McDermott again for taking the time to join Jackie, Reid, and I today for what I hope was a really fun and insightful conversation. With that, I want to turn the floor over to Dr. Jackie Schneider for some comments about our next session.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erik, for moderating. Right, for me, it's been an extraordinarily interesting conversation. So this is the second, but March 16th is our third and final virtual webinar where we're going to be discussing kind of how all these things link back to national security. So this is March 16th. We're taking a few weeks off, and we'll meet back at March 16th, 11 o'clock Pacific time, and we'll be discussing how war games impact national security and defense decision-making, and whether these social science methods that we've been kind of geeking out about today can actually inform these kinds of games, or whether there is just a divide between how we think about war games in academia and how we use them in national security decision-making. So we have the honor of having with us Mr. Bob Work, who was a kind of shadow participant in our first session because he has such an outsized role in the development of war games and the importance of war games within contemporary Department of Defense. He was the 32nd Deputy Secretary of Defense. Dr. Mike Azenka, who's the Director of Research and Learning in the McChrystal Group, who's worked very extensively on red teaming, something we talked a little bit about today. And then Dr. Stacy Pettyjohn, who is currently the Senior Fellow and Director of the Defense Program at the Center for a New American Security, but who previously ran the Wargaming Center at RAND. So looking forward to having all of you join us. And once again, if you can't join us, you missed it, but you want to follow up, we do post on YouTube shortly after the webinar is over. So is there for anybody who's interested. Thank you all for joining us.